Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Conley, Senior Managing Director at Guidepost Solutions. Today's discussion focuses on a critical issue for employers: how to prepare for immigration enforcement before a visit or audit notice occurs. Joining me today are two individuals I have worked with on several matters: Morgan Bailey, who's a partner at Mayor Brown, and John Shofi, my colleague here at Guidepost Solutions. I will each of them introduce themselves. Morgan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Bailey. As John said, I'm a partner at Mayor Brown, and previously I've had several senior official roles at the Department of Homeland Security, including most recently as the Deputy Chief of Staff at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Thanks, Morgan. John?
Hey, John. Hi, Morgan. Hi, everybody. It's great to be on today. Yeah, John Shofi. I've been with Guidepost now for about 9 years. Retired from Homeland Security, specifically Homeland Security Investigations, ICE. Um, Had a lot of time with Mr. Connolly in the government, doing quite a few things, including worksite enforcement and actually standing up the program with John and our colleague, Bill Riley, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And that was the transition from INS to ICE. And ever since, we've been helping quite a few companies, quite a few individuals with their immigration issues. But as you know, today we're going to be focusing on worksite and speaking specifically about companies. So we have a lot of experience in that. Back to you, John.
Thank you both. And as John says, a little bit about myself. I've been with Guidepost now 12 years. Prior to that, I was 30 years with the government, both in DHS and the prior DOJ INS agencies. So when we talk about worksite enforcement, there are a few different scenarios that employers can face. A Form I-9 audit, which is an inspection of employers' paperwork. We all know the I-9. It's celebrated its 40th birthday this coming November. An unannounced site visit where agents show up and are physically present at your location, and a full-scale enforcement operation, often referred to as raids, that typically involve search warrants and arrests. Each one presents different legal and operational challenges, and today we're going to touch on all of them. But the foundation for all of it, regardless of which scenario you're facing, is getting your house in order with your Form I-9 records. That's where everything starts, and it's where employers have more exposure than they may realize. Let's get started on this important topic. John, let's discuss the big picture. What's actually changed on the ground? Because a lot of employers that I talk to feel that they've had a program in place for years and they're fine.
Yeah, John. This is a big one today. It's very timely. We've seen a lot of changes, especially recently, from a policy perspective and even implementation perspective from ICE, HSI. As you say, big picture is key, right? Let's kind of start in that realm. We've seen a ton of shifts in enforcement in general under this administration. And if you go back, it's not that long ago, right? It's about a year and a half from February of 2025, where we started to see a huge shift to a focus on immigration enforcement, not just for individuals, but also focused on companies, especially in relation to the I-9s. We all know the I-9s go back to 1986. That's where it started under Reagan. And the whole premise of the I-9 is basically to cut down on unauthorized employment in the United States. We know there are many loopholes. There are many things that people are able to get around when it comes to employment. But with respect to priorities right now and under this administration versus the previous administration under President Biden, there was a real shift in focus to immigration enforcement, focus on employers, as I said earlier. HSI, where John and I worked, have changed their priorities quite a bit to focus much more on the immigration side versus the customs side when it comes to violations and investigations. But as we're kind of going into this today and speaking about I-9s, what is the focus? And we always try when we do these or we do training or we deal with clients, put ourselves in your place, right? Everybody here in the audience, you're tuning in for a reason. You want to hear how it pertains to you and how it relates to you. So we're going to go with that tact. So, we know that the federal government is very focused on fraud right now, and that's across the board, across the agencies. You've seen the news conferences lately across the departments with respect to fraud, and that does not lose itself when it comes to immigration. So when it comes to I-9s, that's the mechanism, as I said. The notice of inspection that we'll talk about today quite a bit is the main mechanism for the government to touch an employer or touch a business, right? So from an HSI perspective, notices of inspection or NOIs are served to employers, and that's what's happening on the ground today. We're seeing that a lot of that is happening in person, but more so via email, via snail mail, and companies across the country, regardless of industry, are being served with notices to say that ICE, HSI is going to be looking at the I-9s, the documentation that's related to the I-9s, and you have to produce those. So essentially, that's the big one, John, is that there are more notices of inspection that are being served. And we're seeing that across the board, speaking to folks, getting all kinds of stories from people. There's a 3-day window that is typically involved when you're served with an NOI. Just to kind of go through the nitty-gritty real quickly, you have 3 days, business days, to produce those. You can waive that, but it's highly recommended, and everybody on this call is going to agree, not to do that. Do not waive that. Stay with the 3 days. You can request additional days from the agent or from the auditor, whoever it is that's actually touching you. And many times they'll actually do that. We're kind of curious to see if that's going to hold, or they're going to say, no, 3 days is it. Under this administration, they're taking a pretty hard line. So we'll see what happens. But once you receive the NOI, and this is the big shift, John, once you receive that NOI, everything gets locked down. And what I mean by that is whatever you've got in your inventory of I-9s, that has to stay exactly the way it is once that I-9 is signed for and received by you, and the government puts you on notice. There's no longer the ability to check your I-9s and scramble over those 3 days or the 7 days, whatever they give you, to fix those I-9s and get rid of your errors. That's a huge, huge shift. So you have to be cognizant of that. The key here is that you really want to be ahead of the curve. You want to do that before you're ever touched by the government. You want to get your house in order and make sure you have your I-9s corrected as best as possible. We all know that there are certain things that you can't fix, including lateness and some of those more substantive things. But when it comes to those errors that were technical in the past, some of those have become substantive now. You want to be able to fix those, but the key is you want to do that before the government actually touches you. A couple of other things, John, that have changed is the fact that ICE is ramping up. HSI is ramping up with personnel, agent support, forensic auditors, et cetera. They're going to be doing a lot more hiring, et cetera. But that just means that there are going to be more notices served, especially here in 2026. The other thing is AI. And I know that's a phrase that gets used a lot today and maybe overused, but we can't stress it enough that the fact is that the government, including ICE, HSI, and the rest of the departments that are in enforcement, are using those tools. They're using AI. What that means is that patterns, trends that they can identify are more easily identified now with AI. So once they get a hold of your I-9s and your documentation, guess what? They're going to be using those tools to be able to figure out what other evidence of anything with respect to violations. The worst that it could be is any kind of criminal wrongdoing, and that could all be identified much more easily with AI. So you've got to be cognizant of that. The other thing is, the agents are going to be looking for patterns, including clusters of employees that have similar document issues, fraudulent documents, documents produced by the same vendors in the same communities. A lot of those things are going to come to fruition, and you've got to be cognizant of that. John, I think that's really it with respect to big changes. We can discuss a lot more as we go on. I know Morgan's going to have a lot to offer as well.
Thanks, John, for that. And as the volume gets higher, and Morgan, maybe you could put this into a legal context for us. What does this shift mean for the employers from a regulatory standpoint?
Well, what John is describing operationally really reflects a fundamental policy shift. What we've moved away from is remediation and education to really direct employer accountability. But a lot of employers haven't internalized what that actually means for them yet. I think an underlying factor in this is that, in addition, DHS has changed the interpretation of some of the longstanding Form I-9 rules. So one of the most significant changes is what DHS now considers a finable error on that Form I-9 itself. So for nearly 30 years, the framework that governed this was something called the Virtue Memo. And that was named after Paul Virtue, who was a senior INS official when he issued it in 1997, and he later was a partner at my firm. That memo was in place until just a few months ago. The Virtue Memo drew a clear line between technical I-9 errors and substantive ones. Technical errors included items such as like a missing date, a blank field, an incomplete entry. And the memo gave employers a 10-day window to correct them without fines. But that framework has changed earlier this year, and ICE reclassified most of those technical errors as substantive errors, carrying immediate penalties.
John, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, Morgan's absolutely right. Morgan, great points. As you said, and I touched on it, there are quite a few shifts in policies, including a very recent one, and there's a fact sheet that ICE HSI has put up. There's many, many things that they put on their website back in March, April, et cetera. So it's good to check on those. But what that means practically for all of you as employers, et cetera, is that, things that were correctable before are no longer correctable, okay? Missing, as Morgan says, there are certain things, and I'll name a couple, missing or incorrect dates of birth. We've seen all of these, right? Incorrect or omitted document titles, right? Um, the other one that's a big one that we're seeing quite a bit is when you accept a receipt for a lost, stolen, or damaged card for an initial hire, right? For somebody who just starts with you as an employee. And you don't follow up with that employee to either get a copy of that document, let's say a social security card, or now you have that alternative. You can accept other documents if they have that to present. But if you don't get that done within that 90 days and you don't properly, or if you do get them back and you don't properly record them on your I-9, that's another thing that could be a real problem for you. The other thing that we're seeing, and Morgan, this will resonate with you, is, if you have folks that you have to provide assistance to, employees, whether it's translation or preparation of the I-9, really helping them out with Section 1, you are required by the government, by ICE, and they're actually focused on this. There was a specific piece on their website where they said they were going to be focusing on this, is Supplement A. You have to fill out Supplement A, whether it's translation, preparation, or both. And you better put down whoever did that, whether it's one person, two people, three people. But providing that assistance, you better make sure you've done Supplement A. Once you get that NOI, et cetera, things are frozen in place. Don't go back and try to fill in the blanks and fill out a Supplement A in a rushed kind of manner. They'll figure that out, believe me. But they're looking for all of that. And as Morgan says, those trigger fines for sure. And just keep in mind the fact that it's not how many errors you have on an I-9. You could have 10 errors that they identify or that you're living with. Let's say it's late and you've got a couple of errors. All it takes is one error. And as John says, and as Morgan says, it could be a minor error. One uncorrectable error equals a fine amount of 280 days, $280, up to about $2,800, depending on many different factors. So it's really, really important that you keep that in mind. There's a lot of employers out there that have built their compliance posture around the assumption that they'd have an opportunity to fix minor mistakes. That's completely gone. So make sure you keep that in mind and are cognizant of that. Yeah, John, that's basically what I have to add to what Morgan said. Well said, Morgan.
And John, and what we are seeing on the ground, such as these broader audits, the faster pace, the pattern analysis, that's not happening in a vacuum. It's backed by a policy framework that's really removed some of that discretion that used to, in many ways, soften enforcement outcomes.
Thanks, Morgan. I'll add one thing to what both of you have said, which are all key points. What surprises employers when I tell them the government starts forming an impression in the first few minutes of an interaction. How you respond, who's in the room, whether someone says the wrong thing, that initial interaction sets the tone for everything that follows. And actually, let's dig into that because I think it's one of the most important things we can talk about today. So, John, when you showed up at a work site, and I know you've done this, when you were in the government, what were you actually looking at before you even sat down?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. So, it's a coined phrase, but it's really, really relevant. Totality of circumstances, right? You and I both did this. We worked with many, many agents that did work site and other kinds of operations. If it's an NOI that you're serving, right, and you're coming up to a work site, you're likely not coming in with a ton of people. It's just going to be you and maybe a partner, or you and a forensic auditor, or maybe even you by yourself. So that's kind of low key, right? But what you want to be looking at is how the reaction is by whoever it is at the front door, whether it's a receptionist, a manager, whoever it is, that if you have to knock on it or if security lets you in, it could be a security person, right? What's their reaction? And you always look for that, right? You kind of a little bit of a psychiatrist or a psychologist when you're an agent, because it's the reaction that you get that makes a huge difference. If somebody is completely stunned, they look at you like a deer in the headlights and they don't know what to say, they start fumbling, bumbling, making calls, all that kind of stuff, that panicky kind of behavior, then you know that the place really probably hasn't prepped. They don't even know maybe even what an I-9 is. If they do, it may be HR that knows about I-9s. They haven't really trained their receptionist or their security people with respect to if ICE arrives or if DOL arrives, right? Or it's any other departmental agency that's out there that has the ability to knock on a door. So they really get kind of panicky. If it's an operation, that's a different story, John. Like you're usually coming up to the place, especially if it's a search warrant, et cetera, et cetera. You're looking for things like people trying to basically run, right, out the back doors, exits, et cetera, et cetera. Once you get to the front door, you'll kind of get a read on that as far as what the receptionist or whoever is there, the manager, and some of the managers have no clue as to what's going on. They probably haven't even heard of Homeland Security investigations. But yeah, all those kinds of things are really key. You really have to kind of read the room and know the totality of circumstances. And agents like us and folks that are in there now, they're all trained up on to look at, all of this kind of stuff, to look for those kind of key factors. And don't lose the fact that all of that goes into agent notes, okay? So the totality of circumstances isn't just for the agent to absorb and say, "Oh, I saw this, I saw that." That actually goes into the official record of a case. So if there's further investigation and it becomes more of like a criminal type case, those notes and everything else are going to factor in. Even if it doesn't, and it's just a civil administrative fine case because of your notice of inspection and your I-9s, your documentation, if it all adds up to a fine, those could be aggravating circumstances as opposed to mitigating circumstances. So really just short and sweet. If you've got your act together as a company and you've prepared everybody for the eventuality that ICE could knock on the door, you could receive a notice of inspection, or John, as you say, when you do your training, et cetera, is it a warrant, right? Is it a judicial warrant? Is it a subpoena? All those kinds of different things. Are they prepared? And if they are prepared, you'll probably know it as an agent. You'll recognize it. The person stays calm. They stay kind of cool, collected. Do you mind holding 1 second? I'll get a hold of the person that I'm supposed to get in touch with. Take a seat. All those kinds of things. So it really depends on what you see when you come through that door. But we've seen the gamut of all kinds of things: panic to complete calmness and complete order. And that's basically what we see, John, across the board.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And if I could add to one of the things I always looked at was whether the employer asked for credentials, my identification. The company that says, "May I see your credentials and copy the notice?" let me contact our counsel before we proceed. That tells you they're prepared. It's professional, it's appropriate, and honestly, it's what, myself and our fellow agents expected from a serious organization. It didn't make me adversarial, didn't mean, the enemy or anything like that. It actually told me this is an employer that took compliance seriously and was prepared. Compare that to the employer that you show up, and John, we know this, who just waves you in, gives you the full access, starts answering questions, and I'm sure Morgan will jump in here in a second about the legal parts of this, without any structure. That's not cooperation, that's lack of preparation, right? It usually means there's no plan. They didn't plan for this happening, which usually means there's either problems in the file, or even if there aren't problems in the file, they never had a plan for the situation. The physical environment matters too. Are people moving boxes? What's going on? Is someone at a shredder? Are employees suddenly heading for exits? All of this is documented by the agents, right? And even if it turns out that it'd be coincidental that somebody was actually just, doing something else at the same time, or people were moving offices just through natural course of business, it creates a narrative and report that's hard to walk back later. And Morgan, I'm sure from the legal perspective, you would address that.
That's right. And that's why it's important for employers to create a response plan in advance. And for the people who will actually be involved in those first interactions to be well prepared. So it's not enough for the CEO or the general counsel to know what to do. The security guard at the front gate needs to know. The receptionist needs to know. The plant manager needs to know. And of course, your HR team needs to know. And it's critical to make a determination in advance about who's going to speak for the organization. So someone needs to be designated as serving as the primary contact for the ICE agents. And there should be a backup person for each role. You don't want to break down because someone is on leave, or they're at lunch, or they're unavailable for some reason. Because think about it, whoever the agent encounters first is the person whose words and reactions really set the tone. But the overall interaction demonstrates whether or not the organization is ready and does it appear to be compliant. And the first person who's interacting, the script can be pretty simple. It's welcome. May I see your credentials? Let me contact our designated representative. And that initial contact should make a copy or write down the details of the credentials and the stated purpose of the visit. That's it. No substantive conversation, no volunteering information, no apologizing or explaining. Just a calm professional handoff to the person who's been trained to manage the interaction. And that person's first call should be to counsel.
Thanks, Morgan. And I'll say, when I showed up at these companies, some of the first 5 minutes, I was happy when they were boring, right? The company was polite. They verified my credentials. They asked for a copy of the notice, directed us to a conference room, and said counsel will be on the phone in 5 minutes. Nobody said anything interesting. Nobody panicked. Nobody gave us anything to write down other than employer followed established protocols. And that's the key here is what we're talking about, the established protocol. That's what a good preparation looks like, and it's remarkable how rarely we see it, or we saw it at the time. All right, so now let's get into the notice of inspection itself. John, can you walk us through the mechanics? What happens and where do employers go wrong?
Yeah, absolutely, John. Yeah, we've got a good slide right here. What happens when the notice arrives, right? So there's a number of ways. I mentioned it earlier. It could be you could receive a notice by mail, right? Or you could receive it by FedEx, etc. It could be an email with an attachment with the actual notice of inspection, very likely with an administrative subpoena that outlines exactly what the government's looking for, because it's not just the I-9s, it's not just the documents that go along with it if you keep copies of documents. But it could be other things, corporate records, et cetera, payroll records. We'll get into that. But, the one that really trips people up the most, John and Morgan and everybody on, is the other one where somebody comes through the door in person, right? It's an agent flashing their badge and credentials, an auditor, et cetera. It's basically a representative of Homeland Security. Once they come through the door, it kind of catches people off guard. Like we said, some people they've got their stuff in order and some people don't. A lot of panic. But essentially, like I said earlier, you've got 3 days at minimum, okay? Unless you waive it, You're kind of silly if you do that, so don't do it. But if you accept that and you don't ask, or you do ask for an extension, they say, sorry, Charlie, I can't give you an extension. It's 3 business days. So if it happens on a Friday, it's not like you've got to get it ready by Monday. You've got those 3 business days. But you have to produce your original I-9 records. If they're paper, they're paper. If you've got copies in paper of the documents, that's also in paper. So you're going to be handing over a box of a whole bunch of stuff. If it's electronic, then you're going to be handing it over electronically. Whatever the government wants to, they'll specifically delineate what they need and how to do it. So you will get instructions on how to do that. What employers misunderstand is that what they can and what they can't do during the 3 days time. And we mentioned it earlier. You can organize, you can get yourself together. If it's in paper, you might have to go through drawers, like John said earlier. There may be things all over the place. And if they're in different places, locations have expanded as well. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. It used to be where they would come to or serve a notice on one business. It was for that one location. Now we're seeing if it's a business with multiple locations, that NOI, that notice of inspection, could pertain to multiple different places. So if you've got I-9s in 3, 4, 10 different places, and you only have 3 days and they expect them back at headquarters, everyone's going to have to scramble to get those I-9s and get them back to you at headquarters to be able to produce those to the agent. So again, keep that in mind as well. But you're only able to organize, pull files, all that kind of stuff. What you can't do is what we mentioned earlier. You can't start going back, trying to fix, trying to scramble to figure out what's wrong, what's right, calling somebody like Morgan, calling somebody like us in a panic and saying, we need you guys on site to try to fix these right away. Guess what? We can't do that anymore. We used to be able to do that and scramble to get out to places, but we can't do that anymore as per the government's policies. So, the actions don't resolve the deficiency. It's going to create the problem of obstruction if you do try to do that. They will figure that out. Just as a quick example, and I'll be quick about this. Let's say you have a restaurant group that gets in a notice of inspection on Monday, right? HR realizes that they're missing a bunch of forms, like let's say 20 forms for 20 employees. Over the next 2 days, they call the employees in, they have them fill out the new forms because they never did them, and they start backdating to the original hire date, the date of hire. That's going to be spotted. John and I used to be able to see that. There's a lot of ways to figure that out. It could be the ink, how fresh the ink is. There's a lot of different ways, right, John, to figure that out. Please don't do that. That's going to constitute a criminal violation. They're going to present the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and next thing you know, you're going to have a lot of bad stuff happening. So, what started out as a civil thing is now a criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. As I said, the other thing is, the scope. The NOI asks for payroll records, employee lists, business records, sometimes corporate structure, certificates of incorporation. The government's going to cross-reference all of that stuff and make sure that you've produced everything that you're supposed to. If your I-9 file shows that, has 200 forms, let's say, and payroll has 250 people, and that could be everybody who's current, but it also could go back at least a year prior to people being terminated. So remember that. You can't get rid of I-9s just because people are terminated. There are restrictions and requirements on how far you can or how long you have to keep those I-9s. But if there's a discrepancy in your payroll records, and they're going to have, with all the sharing of information, with the IRS, with Social Security, et cetera, a lot of times ICE has that in advance of even coming through the door or even serving the notice of inspection. So please keep that in mind. Don't try to do anything stupid like with your I-9 records, with your payroll records. Whatever it shows, it's going to be. So if it shows 250 employees that you're supposed to produce I-9s and you only have 200, give the 200. Don't try to fill in the gaps ahead of time because that's going to become a real problem, John. I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Great, thanks. Morgan, can you pick us up from there? Because, this is the piece where a company that's prepared, they're going to have, Mayor Brown, or they're going to, have counsel on call when something like this happens. So, why don't you tell us from your perspective how this is handled?
Right, that's right. The moment an employer receives a notice, counsel needs to be involved. Not just to help manage the response, but because everything that happens next, the internal review, the Form I-9 assessment, the conversations, can, and in most cases, should be privileged. But without counsel directing it, everything can be discoverable. So sometimes people ask, what is privilege? It's a rule of evidence that protects confidential communications between a client and their attorney from disclosure. And it has a really good purpose. The purpose is to encourage clients to communicate candidly with their lawyers without fear that those statements would later be compelled as evidence in court. But here's how that can go wrong. Let's say a manufacturing company gets nervous about enforcement, pulls all of their Form I-9 records, maybe they have 400 of them over a weekend, and they create a color-coded spreadsheet of every deficiency. And they email it to the VP of operations with the subject line, I-9 problems we need to fix. 3 months later, they get an NOI. The government requests all compliance-related documents, and that spreadsheet is produced. The employer has handed the government a prioritized list of its own problems. And the fact that those problems may not have been fully remediated becomes evidence of knowledge. On the other hand, if that same list had been sent to counsel with a request for legal advice, the list may be not subject to discovery. So there's a significant difference there.
Thanks, John. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, you're on mute, John.
Thanks, Morgan. I'm sorry. I wanted to emphasize what Morgan had to say there and kind of like underscore what she said. It's really an important point. Um, from the enforcement side, if you've got an employer that hands over a memo or a bunch of memos, whatever it is, that basically self-identify a problem, right? That they've done a self-audit and the memo it says that we've identified 40, 50, 100 different deficiencies. That means the government doesn't have to dig as deeper or have as much suspicion, right? They start to come across a bunch of different errors. That's going to lead to a lot of things that they have suspicions about, and they're going to start to go down rabbit holes. If you provide memos of explanation, like what Morgan said, that really are very transparent, right? You're very overt. You're right up front with everything. It says that you did an audit and you discovered this and that. That whole thing changes. The dynamic of the investigation, whether it's civil or it's criminal, anything, it really helps tremendously when you self-disclose. You're kind of providing the government with a little bit of a roadmap, right? You're showing them exactly where you've been and where they can go to corroborate that and make sure that that's exactly what you did. That's great. It builds good faith, right? And it also builds a potential for mitigating circumstances, which is really important. But good faith is really, really the key here. Yeah, so Morgan, thanks for that. Great points.
So good. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about what actually in the Form I-9 files, right? When you're reviewing them, like what are the most common problems and what makes you start digging deeper, John?
Yeah, we mentioned some of them, John, during this call, and there are a whole bunch of them. But the most common problems that we come across are really basic ones. They're really very simple. For non-electronic system generated I-9s, whether it's paper or the form filled, the I-9 form that's on the CIS website, where it's a form fill type thing, very basic. Um, I made a list for myself just so I'd remember what we can say here, but missing signatures, right? Missing dates of when things are supposed to be dated, signed, etc. We see that all the time. Incomplete fields, right? So if you're doing it on paper or form filling, we typically see a lot of that. We see some fields that are just missed. And by the way, pay attention a lot going forward to section 1. I know a lot of us as employers, as people that help employers, whether it's attorneys, consultants like us, folks that help companies, we all kind of gravitate to Section 2 and we focus on Section 2. Like, what did our client, what did our employer do wrong? Because that's your responsibility as Section 2, right? Is the employer's part. But we're seeing this time and time again when we go out and we help or we do remote audits, is Section 1 is screwed up somewhere. The problem with Section 1 is, like I said earlier, if there's a problem in Section 1, there's an error, even a simple error, like an omission or a wrong date of birth, right? One digit's off or whatever, it's inverted or anything else. I call that a sticky violation because that's going to count. And that's going to cost you just as much as 10 errors on an I-9, whether you have that one simple error. The problem with Section 1 is you only have the ability to correct that on your time while your employee is employed with you. Once they terminate, once they're out of your employment, you cannot go in and touch that Section 1. That's impossible to do. It's illegal to do, and you are stuck with that. You could fix everything in Section 2, but if something is in Section 1 and you can't touch that, guess what? You're completely stuck with that. Other things like inaccurate document numbers, expiration dates, attestations, we see it all the time. They're completed incorrectly. The bigger issues, the more overt, larger issues include expired documents that were never verified or re-verified, excuse me. There are a ton of EAD, employment authorization documents, work permits out there now for people that have applied for asylum over the last 3 years, 4 years, right? Those CO8s, you see them all the time. The C11s, all the other ones, the TPSs, the A12s and the C19s, which is a big deal right now. We're not going to get into all of that. But if you can't document that properly and you have not done your extensions properly, sometimes you have automatic extensions based on Federal Register notices, all those kinds of intricate things that are very, very basic, but they're really important because you don't want gaps in employment, right? So just like if you don't re-verify someone and they should be coming back in with their new work permit, if you don't get all that right, that could be a lot of a bigger problem down the road if the government touches you, because that's equivalent to knowingly hiring somebody who doesn't have authorization. It's called continuing to employ. That's not a good thing, and you don't want to be caught with any of that. None of those gaps. Late completions, as I mentioned earlier, John, those are sticky because you can't fix late. Late is late. Section 1's late, Section 2's late. You have to live with that. Each substantive violation can be a separate fine. Multiply that across the board, and you're looking at like huge financial exposure, as we all know. It all adds up, right, John? I mean, depending on the formula, the algorithms, and everything else. And then you throw AI into this, John, it could be a huge fine depending on what they find.
Right, and what
Morgan?
elevates the risk is these patterns. If 30% of the Form I-9s have the same error, that suggests a systematic problem, not isolated mistakes. And these systematic problems may justify expanding the audit or increasing the fines or other escalation.
Yeah, Morgan, just to jump in, I'm sorry. Another flag that I didn't mention is if you have too clean, it's a weird phrase, but it's in quotes. If you have too clean files, meaning that everything is immaculate, right? Everything is perfect. The forms are all completed. And here's where it kind of goes sideways. All your forms are completed, let's say on the same day, right? For employees that are hired when? Over months, right? Or even over a year. And all of a sudden the government sees all these great lead, but guess what? They're all completed on the same day. That's a real problem because what is that raising? It's raising, backfilling, right? Or you're backdating, all those kinds of things. They're going to spot it, right? We know how to spot it from our experience, John and I, and everybody else who's been an agent, but don't try to do any of that stuff. AI tools on top of that are going to definitely figure that out in a heartbeat. So again, a real huge caution. Don't do what you're not supposed to do. Please don't try to go back and fix things, right, Morgan?
Right, that's
So,
right.
Morgan, I want to switch a little bit from the I-9 itself to the supporting documents of the I-9, right? So from the legal side, where do you see employers getting tripped up on the documents themselves? And I'm talking about the documents that support, you have to fill out with Section 2.
Main areas is the document validity. That's where employers get into trouble without realizing it. So the standard is reasonably appear to be genuine. So employers aren't expected to be fraud experts, but they are expected to exercise reasonable judgment. The problem is that employers either over-scrutinize, which creates anti-discrimination exposure, or under-scrutinize, which creates potential knowingly higher liability. And neither extreme is safe. And now identity fraud is really increasingly sophisticated. We're seeing borrowed identities and purchase documents and even AI generated documents, which are harder to distinguish from the genuine ones.
Yeah, Morgan, those are great points. John, I'll just chime in here. Morgan said it. There are so many sophisticated schemes now, and we're seeing it more and more and more. Because as employers get, they get better and better at identifying poor documents, bad documents, counterfeit documents. But when you add in a lot of employers jumping on the E-Verify bandwagon and volunteering to be part of that program or being required, depending on certain states, that adds a whole new dynamic to it because of your List A documents, your photo matching. As you get better with clamping down on bad documents, the fraud shifts, and we see this over and over again. It shifts much more to identity fraud. And that could be a combination of a bad document, a counterfeit document, with a good document, let's say an ID card with a good social, but it's not the person. It's not the person because the ID card was made up by a counterfeiter, but they also sold them a social security card that belongs to somebody else. The other way is somebody buys a birth certificate and a social security card that's actually genuine, it belongs to somebody else. And then they go to DMV and they're able to get an ID from a state, right? Whether it's California, Texas, wherever. All of a sudden, they've got two genuine documents. They become that person. And your HR people are not going to spot that right away. That's a very sophisticated scheme, and we're seeing it time and time again. But there's other indicators, there's certain red flags that your trained staff can recognize. And that includes like signature discrepancies. We won't go into all of them, but I'll just touch on a few. Documents that don't match across lists, your age discrepancies, E-Verify, like I said earlier, your photo mismatches. That's huge. And your people have to pay attention to that. That's a great tool. But a lot of times HR people don't pay attention to that. They're kind of afraid to call it out sometimes and they just kind of let it go, or they don't see that there's a discrepancy. That photo is supposed to match exactly. Um, Employers need to be thinking about what tools and technology are available to keep pace. Okay, you've got to stay on top of this stuff today. And as Morgan says, as John says, AI is factoring into this. There are a lot of new tools that the government has, but you need to have some of those tools as well and be able to implement a lot of that stuff. The other thing that really is important, Morgan mentioned it earlier, is you have to have protocols in place. Make sure that you have escalation protocols in place. Because if your HR team is a decent team or even a good team, and they call something out and say, you know what, John, I just don't feel comfortable about this. I think it could be identity fraud because of whatever they articulate, right? It could be a gut feeling, etc. They should be able to escalate to a certain point of contact or a person within your organization. So you want to have those protocols in place and you want early escalation on those things so you could thwart those instances and make sure that you're addressing those. The HR teams need encouragement, they need guidance, all those kinds of things we see that really add up to a good team and a good front line of defense, as we call it. But that's really, really important, right, Morgan?
That's right, that's right. And when the government finds a pattern of fraudulent documents, the question really shifts from just a paperwork error to did you know or should have known? And that can be the line between civil penalties and criminal penalties. The government will look at whether the employer has systems that could have caught it or should have caught it, such as E-Verify results that were ignored by an employer, or re-verification that the employer skipped. This aspect of training that could have been provided, all of that can become evidence of knowledge.
Great, thank you for that. So now I want to shift to the people that actually completing the Form I-9s, right? These are the people on the front lines. Because in my experience, the biggest vulnerability isn't the legal department, it's the HR generalist or the hiring manager, or even, a manager that the I-9 is not his or her everyday job, right? Doing this every day without understanding what's at stake.
John, yeah,
John,
I'll chime in. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, I can't stress it enough. You and I do a ton of training. Morgan, you do a ton of training. There's so many good partners out there that we get, whether they're attorneys, our clients, right? And some of them that you come across, you could tell right away that there are HR folks in that company that are kind of clueless. Unfortunately, they just don't. They think they know what I-9s are, they think they know what they're doing, but they really don't. There's a lot of different nuances, a lot of different things. And you could see it where it's a repeatable mistake, things that they do over and over again. If we just have a sample of the I-9s to look at, we can identify those patterns in a heartbeat. And it's innocently done a lot of times. They think they're doing the right thing, but they're not. They're doing an innocent thing, but it's an overall pattern. But the problem is it's an error on the I-9, like we talked about earlier. A little bit of training goes really, really far. The most practical thing employers can do is make sure that you're training the people that are actually touching the form. It's not a one-time onboarding course. You've got to do substantive training because there are a lot of nuances to this, and you don't want people, messing up on certain things. But when something's off, they've got to know that it's off and what not to do. Okay, so it's really, really important. John, like we talk about all the time, there are intricate things and there are basic things, but you have to know it all. And with training, the lights go on. People are like, wow, I didn't know that. Now I do. And it sticks, right? It stays with them because they want to do a good job. They want to collaborate with people that are on their team. And that's a healthy environment. That's where we see all these great companies out there that are doing a really good job training, making sure policies are in place, all that kind of thing. The other thing is really give it serious consideration. I know you know this, and it's hard to pull the trigger sometimes because of a lot of different reasons, but there are experts out there, and I'm going to blow our whistle. At Guidepost, we've done this for years. We know it in and out. We have training decks. We have training decks that we're constantly changing every day based on what the policies are and the shifts in the government. But what do? We transfer that knowledge over to you as employers or to you as partner attorneys that bring in clients, right? All those kinds of things. And I know there are people on this call where it's come to fruition, where it's really helped and it's helped their team become a much better team. Morgan, same thing with you. We've partnered up a ton of times and done a lot of training, but the lights do go on. Consider, having professional training, not just trying to get through it on your own. And even some of the I-9 online training is inadequate. So really consider that.
And I think, we talked about, training them as to what to do and how to do, but, the what not to do piece is equally critical. Staff cannot request specific documents, cannot reject valid documents because they look unfamiliar. Maybe you're not familiar with what an OPT student would have, cannot direct an employee to provide a different document if they're not comfortable with that. Those actions create exposure, potential liability, and anti-discrimination claims. There needs to be a clear escalation path. In other words, when something feels wrong, the person completing the I-9 should be making that judgment call alone. They need a protocol in place, and they know where to go to get to someone with training or to counsel.
And this really ties back to privilege. If the escalation routes are to counsel, the discussion may be privileged. But if it routes to, let's say, an HR manager who documents it in an email chain, you may have created a discoverable record. So, how an employer designs that escalation protocol really matters. I can give you a couple of examples. So let's say that there's a situation where a new hire presents a social security card, and that looks off. The font seems wrong, the paper feels different. In company A, the HR coordinator maybe emails her boss and says, hey, the social security card looks fake to me, but I accept it anyway because I didn't want a discrimination complaint. What should I do? Her boss forwards it to the operations director. Now 3 people have a documented conversation about a potentially fraudulent document that the company accepted and did nothing about. In company B, the HR coordinator contacts outside counsel for legal guidance, and counsel provides advice on next steps. That conversation may be privileged. It's the same problem, but completely different risk exposure.
John, does that match what you saw from the enforcement side? Does training actually matter when the agents are evaluating, the employer and their systems?
Yeah, definitely, John. It's a huge factor. I mean, that's a big, big thing that is recognizable, like I said, right away. Agents can tell whether or not the HR folks or whoever's responsible for the I-9s know what they're doing. Do they know all the anti-discriminatory things that you have to be aware of, what to ask, what not to ask, all that kind of stuff. And we also, from an enforcement standpoint, you do a lot of interviews of HR people. So that you have to take that into account. And they're going to be able to tell right away whether there's adequate training that's been done or inadequate training or no training whatsoever. So yeah, John, absolutely. From an enforcement standpoint, they will know. They'll figure it out very quickly.
Great. So we've talked about the landscape, the first 5 minutes when the enforcement agents show up, the notice of inspection, the I-9 accuracy, how to complete one accurately, training for our programs. Morgan, what does the real readiness actually look like, though?
Readiness really begins with an accurate assessment of the employer's current compliance posture. That often involves having a third party conduct an audit because an employer's internal team may be essentially blind to the errors. Their protocols are so ingrained within the organization that they really can't see the errors, or maybe they're not aware of the requirements. And this is important. A response plan is only as good and as strong as the underlying Form I-9 program. So a well-organized strategy has limited value if your underlying Form I-9s are deficient. Readiness is that entire picture. So it means accurate forms, regular external audits, trained staff, clear protocols, and a plan for when the government shows up.
John, do you have anything more on that?
Yeah, I'll chime in. The plan's got to be specific, right? And this is really, really important. I mean, the slide's great. Who receives the NOI, right? Who's going to be the person actually signing for it? Who calls counsel? That's really, really important. And how quickly do they get a hold of counsel? Who's going to be talking to the agents? Like I mentioned earlier, you want to be courteous, you want to be in control, stay as calm as possible, all those kinds of things. Who's going to be pulling the records after somebody serves a notice, right? All that type of thing. Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned a lot of this earlier, but essentially, you want to make sure that and you've got a protocol in place that's really solid, John.
And this protocol and plan, it has to be tested. It's the reason why folks have fire drills in buildings, right? Regular external audits, mock inspections, as we call them, which is you conduct an inspection as the government would look at your I-9s, see how you would stand. Scenario walkthroughs, what happens if they come with a warrant? What do we do if they come just with an NOI? Every client who does this finds gaps they didn't know they existed. John, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll add real quickly because we definitely want to take some questions if we can. But yeah, you've got to make sure that it's not just headquarters if you have multiple sites that know the protocols, right? That's got to be pushed out to all locations, and it's got to be completely transparent to everyone as to what happens, right? And what's got to be, you do your mock drills, all those kinds of things. But, we've seen agents and we've been in these scenarios where you show up at a satellite location or, whatever it is, and they're clueless. They just have no idea as to what they're doing. And they make statements, they start talking, and it's completely out of context, and it creates exposure, right, Morgan? So, you've got to make sure that it's across the board, consistent and transparent within your company. Just make sure everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing.
And what John describes is how it could go wrong in practice, right? A logistics company, for instance, with a distribution centers in 8 states, say, has a solid response plan at the corporate level. Immigration counsel is ready. Everything's in place. The protocol is clear, but no one trained the warehouse managers. So when agent hand delivers a notice of inspection at a facility, in Texas or another location on a Tuesday morning, the warehouse manager doesn't know who to call. He tells the agent, yeah, we've had some issues with paperwork. I know some of these guys probably have issues. He's trying to be cooperative, but he just made statements against the company interest to a federal agent. That, as we talked about earlier, that'll all go into that report, okay? So the thing we want to say is readiness isn't a one-time project. It's got to be pushed down to all levels of the company. Workforce changes, the manager of that facility changes, I-9 files change, regulations change. We've seen that over the last, year and a half now. Technology landscape changes. We talked about AI, we talked about automated systems, both what the government is using to analyze employer data and what bad actors are using to create fraudulent documents. A program that was solid 18, 20 months ago may have gaps today. Build in regular assessments, underprivileged, to keep pace.
Yeah, John, just to kind of underscore and emphasize, we keep coming back to the point. Just get your act together and do it now. Do it ahead of time, right? You want to be prepared. You want to have everything to be, absolutely sound, operational expertise, legal guidance, just working together. Everybody understands it from the top down, all right? All the way down. So that if it's an employee that encounters, they all know what to do. There's no scrambling, there's no panic. And again, agents, representatives of the government, they're going to see it, they're going to know it, they're going to sense it. So just be prepared, get ahead of the curve. That equals success, right? Be ahead of the curve on all of this stuff. Yep.
Thanks. So I know we're coming up to the end of our hour, but I want to turn to the panelists for final thoughts. Morgan, what do you want people to walk away with?
Environment has changed. The enforcement posture is different than it has been in the past. Tolerance is lower, the consequences are higher. So it's really important to proactively address these issues, to prepare in advance.
Thank you, Morgan. John, any last thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of real quick ones. Corporate risk, right? You're all in the business of corporations most of the time, some other businesses. It's all about risk and stacking those up. What's the prioritized risk? Guess what? Immigration risk, all this employment eligibility verification risk has risen up to the top layer now, and everybody knows it. You've got to be on top of your game, get ahead of the curve, make sure everything's in order, call in experts as you need to, and as is probably prudent, and we can help you. There's no doubt, and we can do it in quick fashion too. Doesn't take a lot of time, but at least you could sleep at night. You know that things are ready if the government touches you.
Great. Thank you, John, for that. And I think I would add is, readiness is not a document. It's not a manual. It's a discipline. It has to be, ingrained in the entire institution, right? And it requires operational expertise and legal guidance, because as Morgan talked about, if you do a lot of this underprivileged, it definitely will work to your advantage. When those two work together, the legal guidance and operational expertise, that's key to the whole process working well for you as an employer. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I'll open it up for any questions that anyone might have. Well, I just have one quick question here that someone asked. Morgan, I'll turn to you. If ICE shows up unannounced at one of our locations, are we legally required to let agents into the non-public areas of the facility? It's a great question.
Yeah, that's a critical question, and one that the response plan should really address specifically. So public and non-public areas should be clearly delineated. Agents generally need a warrant or consent to access non-public areas, although there are some exceptions. But it's really important for employers to really be trained on the difference between what is permitted and the difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant, the difference between a notice of inspection and a search warrant. And the response plan should designate someone at each location who knows how to receive agents, verify credentials, as we said, and really politely direct the interaction while counsel is being contacted. So being professional and cooperative in tone while protecting the business is really important.
Morgan, thank you for that. We've reached the end of our hour. I'd like to thank my two co-panelists with me, Morgan and John, for your time today and your expertise. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day.